Good afternoon, and welcome to another session of our comparative religions classes that we've been doing here at Rydal Park. Last week, when we were together on TV, we were looking at the origins of the traditions of Islam, beginning with a man by the name of Muhammad in the 7th century, living in what is now known as modern-day Saudi Arabia, primarily in the cities of Medina and Mecca. Muhammad was a young man who had been deeply affected by the world around him. A lot of deaths in his family, living in a culture and a society at the time that was filled with all kinds of evil practices, a lot of infighting between all the various different groups fighting for political power. And he had been very troubled by those. And he was a very spiritual, religious type of person. He spent a lot of time in reflection, meditation, and prayer in trying to discover the way that he was supposed to live. He has a series of dreams, visions, revelations, conversations with God that helped him to understand what the world was supposed to be like, and began collecting all of these images and visions and began to put together a system of belief that we now today know as Islam. The tradition spread rapidly in the time of Muhammad's life. It spread throughout all of the Middle East, over into Asia. It had become a larger impact in the world than anything that the Greco-Roman world had done. This impact of Islam has literally today been spread throughout the entire world. Well, Muhammad was very instrumental in this, and we're going to see how some of his life played an impact in it. But what happened was, after his death, there were a lot of questions and a lot of issues that were being raised. And primarily, the followers of Muhammad were wondering who was going to be the successor, who was going to follow after him and take the leadership role in the tradition. And what happens there is a schism that takes place in Islam. Today we're going to look at a group known as the Sunni Muslims, the followers of Muhammad, and we are looking in the next couple of weeks at other traditions that have developed out of the Islamic culture. But today our focus is going to be primarily on the Sunni tradition. So let's take a look at that now. The traditions of Sunni Islam begin with recognizing that Sunni Islam is one of the two major branches of this religious tradition. The Sunni make up approximately 80% of the Muslim population in the world. This is the largest and most cohesive group of Muslims that we see, and even into our world today. They are the majority in most Islamic countries outside of Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and Bahrain. In those areas of the Middle East, what we primarily find are the Shia Muslims, and we'll be talking a little bit about them now, and next week we'll go into a much greater detail about Shia. The Sunni, or the Sunnah, is the singular word, is translated in several different ways, and it means the trodden path. It is the way, or it is understood as habitual practice. And that becomes important for understanding this religious group. They refer this, the Sunnah, is the example, the trodden path, the way, the habitual practice of the Prophet Muhammad and of his followers. They set down the guidelines for how people are to live their lives. And the role there is to really follow in that example, in that practice, in that way. The Sunni trace their origins to the 7th century in the Common Era, beginning with the teachings of Muhammad. But what happens is, when Muhammad dies, there are disagreements that arise over who is going to follow him. Following his death, the Muslim community was confronted with the question: who's going to be his successor? Who's going to be the spiritual and the political leader of this group of people? Because one of the things that we will see as we're going through this is, in this tradition of Sunni Islam, You cannot separate the spiritual from the political. You can't separate the political from the secular, from the spiritual. They are all combined together as a part of the way of living, the practice. This is the tradition that is very strong. Who's going to be the spiritual leader of the group, and who's going to be their political leader as well? Muhammad, at the time when he died, had no living male heirs. And he never really officially or universally appointed someone to follow after him as the leader. The Sunni maintain that the Muslim community was to select the Prophet's successor, or as the name is known as the Caliph. They thought it was up to the members of the community to select who was going to be the next leader. And that led to a lot of disagreements and a lot of infighting that occurred. It was generally agreed upon by all of the people at the time of Muhammad's death that the next leader should be somebody who comes out of the same tribe as Muhammad. It was called the tribe of Qurayshi, and they were believing that it was somebody out of his tribe, his clan, his kindred, that should be the follower, picking up and going with what his teachings were and to carry them on to the next level. According to tradition, the ailing Muhammad, before he died, designated his long-term companion, Abu Bakr, as his successor. They say this happened one day when they were meeting together in a time of worship and prayer, and Muhammad had asked Abu Bakr to go ahead and lead the community in congregational prayer. This was such an important role in the life and the worship and practice of Islam at the time that, well, the tradition says if Muhammad had asked him to do this, he must be the one who has the leadership skills and the spiritual ability and the political ability to become the leader. And so a lot of the tradition begins with trying to make sure that Abu Bakr is the one who becomes the next leader. Shia Islam, this is the other branch that we'll talk about next week, however, believes that the Prophet chose his son-in-law, Ali, to be his successor. The term Shia comes from the Arabic phrase Shiat Ali, or the party of Ali. And they believe that he is the one who is to be the leader. And of course, this dispute sets the terms for a schism in the Islamic community. It sets up a long-lasting division over who is going to be the proper leader. That division, which takes place at the death of Muhammad, continues to this very day. This split that has occurred between the Sunni and the Shia continues to go on, and sometimes it can break down into actual fighting between the two different groups. It's still an issue in our world today. Now, what happened was the Sunni, who are the majority of people in this tradition, are going to follow Abu Bakr as the leader. And he dies in the year 634, which is just about 2 years after the death of Muhammad. When he dies, he is succeeded by Umar ibn al-Khattab. He becomes the leader in 634, and he serves for about 10 years. Umar was murdered in 644 and was then succeeded by Uthman ibn Affan. He becomes the next leader or the next caliph. Uthman was murdered in 656. What you will notice is there's a lot of violence and a lot of fighting and a lot of turmoil in the positions of leadership in this early stages of the tradition. This is all within the first 30 years or so of the tradition growing up. Now, what happens here is you have these two groups. You have the ones that are following Abu Bakr, they're following Umar, they're following Uthman, And they're trying to develop things along the lines of these men being the leadership. However, the Shia have felt that Ali is the one who is supposed to be the leader. Now, what happens here is after the death of Uthman, Ali does take over as the caliphate. And the Sunnis were upset. Abu Bakr dies, his successor Umar is murdered, his successor Uthman is murdered, and the Sunnis feel that the supporters of Ali were not doing anything to investigate and follow up and pursue the criminals who had committed these acts of murder. And so the split that has taken place between Sunni and Shia has now become really, really entrenched. And you've got this division, and as I said, this division has not been healed to this very day. Now, what happens here, we're going to be following the Sunni traditions and the beliefs that they have going forward. As I said, we will be looking at the Shia traditions next week. In Sunni Islam, there is a belief that the Quran is the only actual scripture revealed to Muhammad by God. Now, the Sunnis will adapt to, as I pointed out last week, they will adapt to the stories out of the Hebrew Bible, the stories of creation, the stories of Adam and Eve, the stories of the Noah and the flood and all of that. But the things that become very prominent in this tradition are the stories of Abraham and Abraham's descendants, which begin with his son Ishmael, not Isaac, but Ishmael, and the traditions that follow on from there. The Sunnis do look to the prophets like Moses and Jesus, Elijah. All of these prophets are wonderful things in the Sunni tradition, but their belief is that the only scripture that we truly have is the scripture that was revealed to Muhammad by God, and that is what we now know as the Quran. The other books are good to read, but they consider the text of the Quran to be the unique and uncorrupt record of God's communication with humans. These are the recordings that Muhammad has passed along to the people over the course of the 23 years that he was serving as the leader of the Islamic tradition. They are unique, they are uncorrupt, they are literally the word of God as given to Muhammad. That has that sacredness to it that really makes this book so vitally important to their lives. Now, there's another aspect that goes on here. And this is the influence that emerges in the Sunni tradition was the development in the first 3 centuries of what is called the Hadith literature. The Hadith literature plays a big role. And what this is a recording of sayings and narrations about things that Muhammad said or things that he did, things that he approved of during his life. And they are copied down and recorded as a way of providing a guide for how people are to live their lives. These narratives range from very mundane daily activities like eating and sleeping to far-reaching legal decisions. But as we will see, the tradition in Sunni Islam is that there is no separation between daily living, spiritual life, religious life, political life, life in community. They are all part of the one package. Even normal mundane activities like eating and sleeping are, well, we learn how to do these things from reading the hadith and the narrations that come to us from Muhammad and how he lived his life. A hadith is composed of 2 essential parts. First is what is called the isnad, and this is a chain of transmission. We'll get to that in a second. The second part of it is what is called the matan, the body of the narrative itself. These are stories, these are narrations, these are examples of things that happened in the life of Muhammad, things that he may have said, things that he may have done. And what becomes important here is how they are passed on and communicated. The Quran contains the words that God spoke to Muhammad. The Hadith are written at another point in time by the followers of Muhammad who learned from him. See, Islamic culture is based on oral tradition. We should be familiar with that because the traditions in Judaism, in the early stages of development, Judaism is an oral tradition and to a certain extent continues to be so. Christianity, in its origins, is an oral tradition. The stories that are passed on from the early community to the next generation, all done in oral form. The same is true in the Islamic culture. Everything is based on the oral traditions, the stories that were told by Muhammad and then told by his followers. It was important for the early generations of the Islamic community to attribute the narratives to credible sources. And so, the Isnad is a list of names, the people who heard and transmitted the content of the narrative. The reputation and reliability of these people, both men and women named in the Isnad, is very, very important. What happens here is these teachings of Muhammad's companions have an authority to them. And these are known collectively as the Sahaba. Excuse me on that one. Sahaba. These men and women shared closeness and familiarity with the Prophet that made them the repositories of valuable information. These were the folks initially who were closest to Muhammad. They were there with him during worship and prayer. They were with him at mealtimes. They were with him as they talked in community. They sat together with him and listened to his teachings. And they collected these and they remembered these stories that were not a part of the Quran, but they were ways of trying to find how we live, what we do in life, how do we act, how do we behave, how do we interact with each other. And these men and women who shared this closeness with the Prophet collected this information down together, and this becomes a part of what we now call the Hadith. Much of the development of Sunnism was connected to these companions and their transmission of this material. They're passing on the lessons that they learned directly from Muhammad himself. Second only to the scriptures of the Quran, these collected writings, these narrations, these stories, lessons are there to really help people to understand practice and law, day-to-day living, and how we structure society and how we structure the religious tradition. Now, what happens here is the period of time between 750 and 1258 in the Common Era is known as the Golden Age of Islamic history. All of these writings have now been collected. The Hadith are there and able to be accessible to everyone. The Quran is available and accessible. It is used constantly in worship and in guiding life. And we begin to move into a real golden age of history in this tradition. These books are now considered to be a part of the canon. They're compiled and collected together and become secondary to the Quran. They have a major role to play in guiding people's life. And it's during this period of time that the Sunni tradition reaches its height. Its understanding of law, its understanding of theology, and its understanding of philosophy begins to shape the worldview of the Sunni culture. And it becomes a very powerful image for living in society. And it gives them a perspective on the world and on history. And it becomes, well, actually a very wonderful aspect of life. Now, as we move into the 8th century, about 100 years after the time of Muhammad, there is a new movement that is beginning, and it starts out in the city of Baghdad, and it is a translation of the Quran and the Hadith out of the Arabic into other languages, particularly the Greco-Roman culture becomes a part of this. And we begin seeing in the traditions of Islam the incorporation of some other fields of study, other fields of knowledge, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. This is an explosion of scientific discovery in the world. One of the other areas besides mathematics and astronomy that is influenced by the Greco-Roman culture and by Sunni Islam itself is medicine. We have rapid advances in all kinds of scientific endeavors and discoveries, and it becomes a very exciting time in the world. I mentioned last week, as these things were happening in the Islamic tradition, the same time period in what we now call Western Europe, we Europeans were living in the Dark Ages, and there was not a whole lot of this kind of study that was going on. Things are beginning to change in this tradition in the Middle East and spreading outwards from there. Another tradition that began was the mystical tradition known as Sufism. Sufism is a very small part of the Islamic tradition, but it comes out of this Sunni expression. The Sufism is very much involved in mysticism. It is involved in kind of a charismatic style of leadership and worship. It's a small group of people, but it still has an influence in the world at times. It also has been suppressed and persecuted quite a bit over the years. But it's a part of this whole growth of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, the sciences, looking at the world in a new and exciting way. Once again, the core beliefs. This is something that is shared with all of Islam, but their traditions are very, very clear about this. Fiercely, loyally, completely monotheistic. There is one God. There's no argument there. There is only one God, and that God is Allah. As I mentioned last week, the word Allah actually comes to us from two different two different Arabic words, and literally what Allah means is the God. Not a God, the God, and that's it. Muhammad is the greatest prophet. He is also the last prophet. He is the last revelation to God to the world, with the final instructions of how people are supposed to live their lives. God has spoken to Muhammad, the prophet, over the course of many years, and those lessons that were learned, the teachings of God that were given to Muhammad, are written down and incorporated into the Quran. The belief in the prophet and the belief in the Quran is very important. Now, some aspects of living life follow up in this tradition. Fasting. Many religious traditions celebrate fasting. It's a part of a spiritual discipline to help you focus on the spiritual aspects of life and to help you focus more on becoming closer to God, becoming more attuned to what God wants you to do. And you do this as a practice to help you in your spiritual journey. In the tradition of Sunni Islam, fasting occurs every year during the month of Ramadan. You are to refrain, unless you have health problems, you are to refrain from eating while the sun is up. You can take water, but that's about it. At the end of as the sun goes down, you are able to have an evening meal, but during the daytime you're supposed to focus on your spiritual life and spiritual practice, and you do this by fasting. Charity is very important. Hospitality in the Middle East is something that is absolutely essential to life. You have to be able to care for and provide for other people, particularly people who are very vulnerable in society. This comes out of Muhammad's own life experiences and his understanding that we have to have this sense of responsibility towards other people. In the tradition of Sunni Islam, charity is vitally important. No matter how bad off you are in your life, no matter how difficult your situation may be, there's a reality that there's somebody who is worse off than you are. And you therefore have a real obligation to provide for and to care for that person. Charity is a mark of the Sunni Islamic culture, tradition, and practice. Prayer, 5 times a day. There are ritual prayers that are to be prayed. And taking that very seriously and incorporating that into your daily living keeps you closely connected to God. And pilgrimage, taking the Hajj, the journey to the city of Mecca to participate in worship in the holy sites of the Islamic tradition. This pilgrimage is an obligation for every able-bodied Muslim in the world. And these make up the core beliefs of Islam, and then there are some other aspects that get carried on as well. In Sunni tradition, there are 6 articles of faith. The reality of the one God. There is no God but Allah. That is it. And this becomes a major statement of faith. The authority of the books of God. Following the prophets of God. Preparation for the day of judgment and the supremacy of God's will. And these all get tied up together in one simple little understanding that comes into play when we deal with preparation for the day of judgment. It is said in the traditions of Islam that people learn more about being prepared for death than they are prepared for living life. The understanding is that for every single human being, there is going to be a day of judgment. And there is an understanding in Islam, and particularly the Sunni tradition, that once a person dies, they are confronted by 2 angels, 2 angelic beings. And those beings are there to ask them certain questions about their life and about their beliefs. The understanding here is that when you die, in order to be prepared for the day of judgment, you have to be able to acknowledge the reality of the one God, to recognize the reality of the role of the prophet and the writings of the Quran, and how you have lived your life. There is no God but Allah. Muhammad is his prophet. The words of the Quran are the holy words. And how you live your life following the prophets of God determines what happens to you on that day of judgment. God's will is supreme over everything in the world. And you, as a believer, are to be attuned to that on a regular basis, daily. So you learn more about this in preparing for this time of death and the day of judgment, and really about learning how to live life. And another article of faith is the existence of the angels of God. In Islam, angels play a primary role. Angels. They are beings that are made of light. God has created the angels to worship and to obey. That's their entire role. They are creatures that are made. They are a part of the creation. They are therefore creatures. But here's the thing. The angels do not have free will. The supremacy of God and God's will is what dictates what happens with the angels. They only do what God directs them to do. They are created to worship and to obey. Angels are used as the emissaries of God. When God has a message to pass on, that message is passed on by the angels, and they can appear to humans in the form of humans or in their own form. It depends on what the nature of the message is. The angels play an important role because they communicate God's will to people. Other duties: guarding the gates of hell. The tradition in Islam is if you have the belief in the one God, there is no God but Allah. If you believe that Muhammad is his prophet, and you believe the works of the Quran, and you believe the life that is put together for us and explained to us by the prophets, you are going to be okay. You are going to go to paradise. But the angels here have this role of guarding the gates of hell for those who have been punished for eternal damnation by not believing the core essential tenets of Islam. The angels record all of the good and bad deeds of all people. There is a balance that is played out in your life between the scales of good and evil, and how you balance those out in your life. And another duty of the angels, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is they are there to interrogate the soul of the person who has died. What do you believe about God? What do you believe about Muhammad? How have you lived your life? How has your life been balanced out between good and bad? And if you meet the test, if you have lived a life according to the principles of Islam, you go to paradise. If you have not, you are subjected to eternal damnation in the gates of beyond the gates of hell. And the guardian angels are there to keep people from leaving. It's a very tough position. Angels play an important role, but there's another characteristic, another otherworldly being that is a part of the Sunni tradition, which is known as the jinn. Supernatural creatures, and these do have free will. They're like angels. They're not human. They are otherworldly beings, but these are ones that have free will and have the ability to exercise aspects of human life. The jinn can be either good or evil. Belief in angels is actually intimately connected to the belief in the ultimate reality of God. It is through the angels that God communicates God's will and indicates how people are supposed to live. Throughout the stories in the Quran and in the Hadith, angels are there as the emissaries, as the agents, the communicators, and the envoys on behalf of God. They come to us to tell us what God wants us to do, because the sovereignty of God is ultimate over all aspects of human existence. Now, the Sunni are typically seen as putting more emphasis on the power of God and his determination for human fate. Sunni are often understood to be more inclusive in their definition of what it means to be a Muslim. They have a much broader understanding of this than Shia does, and we will see how that plays out a little bit next week in the differences between the two. The Sunni tradition has placed a great emphasis on the role of religion in public and political life. There is no separation between, well, we would put it in our terms of the separation between church and state. That's our mindset in America. In our world, we can see a separation between the secular and the sacred, between what we do in public and what we do as a part of a political life in our world. Well, in the Sunni tradition, you can't separate these things apart. They are all a part of the same package. An essential aspect of this is the adherence to the emulation of Muhammad in everyday life. How do you keep the secular and sacred together? How do we keep our public and private lives together? How do we keep our spiritual life and our daily living together? We can only do that by emulation of Muhammad. And this is where the hadith comes into play very strongly in the tradition. This is understood, a basic understanding, that when Muhammad was alive, he was the epitome of good character. Everything he did was right. Everything he did was just. Everything he did was pious. Whether it was political, religious, or just ordinary day-to-day living, he was the epitome of good character. Trying to be like Muhammad, following his moral example, is seen as the highest expression of reverence possible for any human being. You read the stories of his teachings, of acts that he carried out in his life, of things that he did, things that he said. You follow that example, you are being a very reverent person. And that's the object of existence. Contained within this idea of emulating the prophet is a concept of devotion, of pious observance. For Sunni, pietism is putting the sunnah into action. This way of life, this proper pathway of living gets incorporated to everything that you do. From the moment you wake up in the morning and waking from sleep, performing ritual ablutions as you kept yourself clean, as you begin a meal, as you visit a friend. For the Sunnis, putting this into action even goes down to as far as how you are supposed to properly sit in order to show reverence, piety, devotion. Everything in life is potentially sacred. Every single aspect of your existence as a human being has the potential for being a moment of sacredness. The Sunnah provides a model of behavior even in the most mundane aspects of living. There is no real separation between secular and sacred. Everything you do is sacred. It's that way. How you eat a meal, how you visit a friend, how you do everything in your day-to-day living, well, it has to be done with this aspect of devotion and reverence and obedience. And in the incorporation of this, we find what is known as Islamic law or Sharia law. We have heard a lot about this in our society over the past couple of years, particularly the last 20, 25, 30 years maybe, where the Sharia law has become a topic of conversation, and a very sadly misunderstood one. Because this law addresses family, civil, and criminal law. Now understand that this tradition grows out of not only a reflection of the Quran and the Hadith, but also keep in mind that what has influenced Sunni Islam from the 8th century on has been an exposure to Greek philosophy, Greek understandings of law, Greek understandings of how the world works. This kind of understanding of the sciences and every other part of it, Sharia law addresses aspects of family living, civil laws as well as criminal laws. It also addresses laws regarding how you conduct worship. There's a proper way to do worship. There's an improper way to do worship. and Sharia covers that as well. There are some liberal and more secular movements within Sunni Islam. The interpretations of the law are oftentimes very liberal in the way that they are understood. And there are parts of Islam that are very secular in their understanding of the world. There are also several fundamentalist movements which reject and persecute the liberal Muslims. And this is a part of the ongoing struggle and fighting inside of Islam, and particularly within inside of Sunni Islam. And we will be taking a look at that in a couple of weeks, how this fundamentalist movement in Islam has taken these traditions to a different level. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat al-Islami, and Hamas, the political faction in particularly the Gaza Strip right now with the political power there. These are fundamentalist movements inside of Islam. And what we're going to see is these fundamentalist movements have a desire to destroy secular Islam, and they want to destroy Western society through terrorism. They want to bring back to the world a period of religious Muslim rule. They want to get away from the secular, they want to get away from the liberalized aspect of the faith, and they want to make it focused completely and entirely the Shia laws on Muslim rule from the religious perspective. One of these groups, this part of this tradition is called the Wahhabi movement, and we will take a look at that in a couple of weeks. We're going to finish up here today because this is where the end of the Sunni tradition is. Next week, when we pick this back up again, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Shia traditions and how they have developed, and we will continue to look at some other aspects of Islam as we go forward. So for today, that's where we finish. Hope you have enjoyed this, and hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we will meet again next week. Take care.